Ukraine is not a burden for Europe, it's a chance of Europe. Today, European security is unthinkable without Ukraine. Our country has the strongest army in Europe, a dynamic defense industry, and citizens with vast military experience. The real question is, to what extent does Europe itself understand the threat posed by the new authoritarianisms? And to what extent does it realize that helping Ukraine is, in fact, a matter of its own survival? You're listening to the Explain Ukraine podcast. Explain Ukraine is a podcast by UkraineWorld, an English-language media outlet about Ukraine run by Internews Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I'm a Ukrainian philosopher, editor-in-chief of UkraineWorld, and president of PEN Ukraine. My guest today is Yevhen Hlibovytskyi, a prominent Ukrainian intellectual and director of the Frontier Institute. Yevhen is the right person in Ukraine to talk about the big things. Before we begin, a quick reminder, you can support this podcast on Patreon. We rely on crowdfunding to keep our work going. You can also help fund our volunteer trips to frontline areas of Ukraine, where we support both civilians and soldiers. Donations are welcome via PayPal. All relevant links are in the episode description. So let's begin. Yevhen Hlibovytskyi, welcome to this podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for finding time. So we are in Ivano-Frankivsk on the great place which is called Prom-Prilad, which is kind of a place of innovation, cultural innovation, intellectual innovation here. But I would like to talk with you about the question of security. And it's increasingly, we understand Ukrainians that we are now, and this is your point, I think you expressed it many years ago, we are now not the recipient of security from Europe, but rather the supplier of security. Can you develop on this?
Well, it's pretty obvious for Ukrainian observers that it's not only Ukraine that is the problem in the Russian eyes. Therefore, we will see that Russia will be expanding as it gains opportunities. And it sees incredible opportunity in weakness of Europe. And Ukraine actually is someone who keeps Russians' hands tied and does not allow Russia to expand further. We've seen the drones in Poland. We've seen the Russian planes that are breaking the territory of other countries. These are kind of testing the ground's actions. But I think in reality, what has happened is Ukraine over the last 100 years has faced the severe deficit of security, which has hardened Ukraine and made Ukraine more resilient. Whereas on the European continent, in the EU, in the NATO, which is basically most of Europe, we saw quite the opposite. For the first time in human history, we had 4 generations that were raised under assumption of security being provided from the outside, to the extent that a democratic society didn't even have to fully take the bill for security. So what it did, with the agency being so widely disseminated across the society, we had a number of wrong assumptions that came out of this. And the biggest assumption that was wrong was that security is granted. It's just there. It's like a commodity. You don't have to do anything. It's just there. And the case of Ukraine proves that this is an assumption that can be actually quite damaging and potentially even fatal. Russia is disrupting not only the countries that are territorially close. We see how Russia acts in cyber. We see how Russia acts in social media, in information space. We see how it weaponizes trade. We see how it disrupts international institutions. We see how it spreads zero-sum game approach across the world. And it is very interesting to see how the 19th century approaches, to an extent, are efficient in the 21st century. And Ukraine is a unique meld of very traditional approaches and very innovative approaches. And in that sense, Ukraine actually can understand the Russian language, but can respond with innovation. And I think this is where Ukraine actually steps in as a major contributor to European security. Being able to transform the war into drones, being able to fight much cheaper than, for instance, the conventional Western armies would do, being able to innovate on the field, being able to actually digitize its approaches, the war, and having incredible social support, social networks, volunteer networks that actually act to supply the military with what's needed, that act as crowdfunding source for the army, and maybe the amounts of money are diminishing with the state of economy not being too good, but the number of people involved and the general level of activity is not falling. So we see a pretty steady situation in the Ukrainian society.
One of the readings of Ukraine was that before the war, before even 2014, was that, look, we have this climate of insecurity, and that makes us more difficult to innovate, to be creative. So insecurity was a kind of an obstacle to development. Now we see that this is a little bit, we can question that. We can say that it is insecurity and dramatic insecurity that pushes us to innovation, pushes us to development even. In this sense, the supply of security that you are talking about in the European Union probably delays their innovation potential and their technological breakthroughs that we see now in Ukraine. So in effect, in a way, the war, however tragic it is, it actually pushes Ukraine to be more creative, to seek for development, to seek innovation and creation. Would you agree with that?
I would say that creativity is mirroring general entrepreneurial spirit. Entrepreneurship is not necessarily coming out of leadership or willingness to create something new, something that no one has done before. It also can come out of need. And there is abundant need in Ukraine. And in some cases, it's extremely acute. So people feel that they have to do something, and then they step in, and then they do it. And vice versa, in many richer countries, people just don't feel that motivated because life is relatively secure, socially, financially, in every other meaning. Maybe not to the extent that people would like, but definitely not to the point of starvation or the point of extreme poverty or lack of access to basic needs, which in Ukraine, from the security perspective, is being felt by pretty much everyone. It doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, you feel the threat in Ukraine, and it's very visible, very tangible feeling that is present everywhere you go, whatever you do. Doesn't matter on the profession, and even it doesn't really matter where you live, because from that point of view, it's the difference in flight time for the cruise missile is minutes, and it can get to any point in Ukraine. So I think there's this general feeling in Ukraine that we have to persevere, we have to we have to sustain ourselves, we have to be resilient. And it comes from deep understanding, historical understanding of the kind of threat that Russia poses. I don't think that understanding is present outside of Ukraine to the extent that we would like. I think it's acutely felt in Finland and the Baltic countries. I think institutionally, probably the Nordic countries come closer to being able to process this information. I'm surprised how Central Europeans are ambivalent about Russia, because they could have had probably greater reflection on their own history. But nonetheless, they keep on electing the governments that tend to be either pro-Russian or slow. And we also see the difficult metabolism in Germany, in France, in Italy, in Austria, in Spain, and other countries that feel that geography plays to their benefit, while in fact it doesn't. Not anymore, not in 21st century, not with the technologies that are at hand.
Exactly. When I talk about the Russian threat in France or in Spain, people usually say, okay, but can you believe that Russian tanks will be in Paris or Madrid? And this is the way how people perceive the threat. So they perceive it rather in the concepts of the Second World War, like the huge tank assaults and mechanized assaults, or maybe aviation or something like that. While the war is completely different. And for example, there are at least two aspects or three aspects. The first aspect is that there is a hybrid war, so you can have cyber attacks, for example, that can cut off the electricity from your electricity networks, and then some people will die in the hospitals because of the lack of electricity. Then there is a political battle, like the military actions can lead to political results, and I think this is what Russia is thinking about. And the drone attack on Poland, or what you mentioned, the violation of airspace of a number of EU countries, showed that European Union is like a little bit of the house of cards, where during the danger time, everybody will be for itself, for himself. And people might ask in Portugal or Spain, so why should we care about Estonia or Lithuania? And I see this as a major political problem. So military action leads to grave political fragmentation and political disconnection. And this is, by the way, a terrorist logic, because what terrorist does is just act locally but with global consequences. And the third possibility is the drone technology. You can actually move, a camion of drones inside, very deep inside the territory of France or Spain, and then launch a couple of dozens on the governmental buildings, or make a terrorist attack or something else. And that means that the front line, the concept of the front line is really, evaporating, blurred.
Yeah.
Would you agree with this?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think there is another contributing factor to this, which is the security architecture. I don't want to sound in a mode of accusation, because I think this architecture has came as part of the post-Second World War vision, which had probably the best intentions. And we went into the unexplored part of understanding society and understanding the human nature. And no one knew what would happen if we have many generations of wealthy people who are shielded from the war. Now we see empirically that it doesn't work well, and that it's best not to have a separate security union and then a separate wealth or welfare union. And this is the problem with the Ukrainian Euro integration, because Ukraine basically does not need to integrate into the European Union without the security guarantees. The fact that the EU would grant Ukraine all of these incredible improvements in quality of life will not be sustainable if security is not present. We have rebuilt Mariupol once already, and it's been destroyed again. And subjecting European taxpayer to constant rebuilding of something that will be eventually destroyed is not fair. It's not logical, and in that sense, it would be prudent if Euro integration for Ukraine would not be a one-way street anymore. Right now, Ukraine basically has to check all the boxes that the European Union tells Ukraine to check, which was probably all right before this war, but it's not all right at the point where Ukraine is a security provider. And if Ukraine is a security provider, then the question is this part of the equation? And with the current mode of Euro integration, it's not. Ukraine does not really need half measures. Ukraine needs a full integration, which would include security. It's not feasible through NATO, so the Ukrainian solution sooner or later will be asking the EU to transform into a geopolitical union, adding the security component to it. This is the conversation that I'm not sure whether the EU is ready to right now, but eventually the context will push the EU towards this perception. And if this is the case, then it's not only Ukraine joining the EU, it's also the EU joining Ukraine, asymmetrically, but still. So this would mean that Ukraine would contribute in some areas and would be on the receiving end in some other. If we don't do this, then Ukraine would not be in the EU in good faith, for a good reason. And I'm not sure how good it would be for the Union, for the success of the Union, if there are members for the wrong reasons. Look at Hungary or Slovakia or Poland with its court reforms. It's actually a matter of recognizing the values and understanding the common interest. But when you have members who are already inside the club, who cannot be expelled from the club, who either have malevolent intentions or who start playing zero-sum game inside the club, then it becomes a common problem. Ukraine is much bigger than Hungary, and there's risks that if we don't take into account all the interests, that there will be enough resentment sentiment inside Ukraine to play a future disruptive role. So I would say it's very strange to be saying this from the Ukrainian perspective, but there's a lack of long-term perspective on the European behalf. There is lack of understanding and appreciating the complexity of the context. There is, I would say, lack of something that Ukraine used to look up to the Europeans to actually see. Ukrainians wanted to see the European partners as those who have certain level of maturity in judgment and in ability to deal with long-term issues, with the issues that fall into the category of long history. And feeling that Ukrainians have, that however immature and young Ukraine is as a state, as a statehood, sometimes Ukraine remains the adult in the room. And that's the problem, because Ukraine is not the adult in the room at the moment.
I would say that the European Union takes very significant steps from above. Like we have Lithuanian Commissioner Kubilius, who is responsible for defense. We have Estonian Commissioner Kallas and Vice President of the Commission, who is responsible for foreign affairs. But it's not clear whether the decisions are made on the grassroots level or that decisions that are taken are leading to the big transformation at the grassroots level. Just one example. So we are now in this stage of the war where the ready-made weapons do not work. You cannot say that Ukraine will win if it receives 300 tanks. because tanks are very vulnerable on the battlefield. You can say, okay, but let's produce drones. Let's produce 1 million drones in the EU, for example, and that will help Ukraine. Well, the problem is that the requirements to these drones are changing every 3 months. And you should have a very flexible system of communication between a very specific unit on the battlefield, not even the headquarters of Ukraine, because the headquarters, very often, they have obsolete information. What you need to be talking with is the soldiers on the ground and specific units on the ground. And you need to translate their demands into technological solutions that will come within the months, within several weeks, probably within at least several months. And this is what is happening in Ukraine, also not very efficiently in many cases. When we're criticizing Europe that it is not prepared for the war, well, actually lots of Ukrainian soldiers and people inside the army say that Ukrainian institutions are still not responding adequately to the war challenge because they're still too slow and too complicated. So Ukraine itself needs to make a lot of work to deregulate something, a lot of things.
I would argue with that.
But let me finish. And EU also needs to change a lot in order to transform its peace economy into, at least in several sectors, into a kind of a war economy. And I'm not sure we are take the example of, for example, long-term tenders. You have the government contract, you have the company that wants, 3-year or 5-year contract on the specific armaments, and then you understand that in 3 years it's not that much needed, or it needs to be transformed significantly. So you need to have a lot more flexibility. And I'm not sure that this political awareness, which is present in the European elites, at least on the EU level, and in many, many EU member states, at least you mentioned the Nordics and the Baltics, and I think the top level in France and Germany, I'm not sure it's transforming into this grassroots flexibility. What do you think?
Well, first of all, I would argue whether we have this slow motion in Ukraine to the extent that we usually describe it, because what we do is, I think we do an incorrect comparison of Western institutions and Ukrainian institutions. Because if we want to look at the scope that the Western institutions have, then we have to include civil society into that scope in Ukraine. Because the whole idea of Ukrainian governance model is that the state has fewer delegated functions, it has less authority, and part of what the states usually do on the European continent in Ukraine is delegated to the civil society, which acts as a contributor but also as a backup to the government. And if the government is slow and incapable, then the civil society players can be fast and very able. Come Back Alive Foundation is bringing in equipment in the vicinity of hundreds of millions of euros. This is a big game, and it's just an NGO. And in that sense, we can see similar medical foundations. We see other institutions of the civil society. But what's more important is the sustainability that it produces. Because if the system implodes in the West, very often there is nothing to back it up with. And in Ukraine, the basic assumption that we have in our governance model is that the government can implode and that the system can actually fall. So the civil society is actually considering as an option that it would have to catch and sustain the responsibilities for at least some time, for at least a period of time. And this has been the case with the volunteer movements when Ukrainian army was basically decomposed by the Russian elements in the Ukrainian government under Yanukovych administration. So it took roughly 5 months to bring the army back to, at least partially, to fight-worthy condition. And the volunteers stepped in that time. And the same thing happens in military production. A lot of drones that are flying on the front line don't have a paper trail behind them. And when the cycle of innovations in developed countries are measured in years, in Ukraine, on the front line, they're measured in weeks, sometimes in days. Because, sometimes you come up with something and the Russian jamming equipment is proving to be more successful, and the whole sets of equipment have to be completely reprogrammed within hours and days, and there's no time for bureaucratic maneuvers, no time for long research. So as a result, it creates the conditions and it creates the pressures for innovation. And if we are talking in concepts of Schumpeter's creative disruption, Russians provide us enough disruption for the Ukrainians to be put in a position where we have to create. And the lack of Western presence in Ukraine is having two bad side effects. The first side effect is educational. The Western militaries, being usually with little or no military combat experience, actually don't get the experience that they need, or at least see the experience that they need. And the other thing is that the Western institutions that would be present in Ukraine would provide a specimen for the alternative with the comparative Ukrainian institutions. So Ukrainian institutions could actually see this difference and adapt. And in that sense, the question is, how seriously are we talking about partnership? Because if we're talking about marriage, not about one night stand between Ukraine and the EU, then we have to be all in, one way or the other, And it doesn't necessarily mean that we all the Europeans have to come and fight, but that means that they have to stick to the rules. For instance, they have to block the Russian tanker fleet, or they have to be able to find a solid position on the Russian money that have been frozen, or they have to find political will for speeding up the transformation of societies inside the European Union to make these societies more aware of the kind of interventions that the Russians, the Chinese, and others are making into the information sphere, into the education system, into the protests, into the social media discourse, etc. And definitely not enough is done. It's surprising that last year Ukraine was the only country in the European Broadcasting Union, which is an association of public broadcasters, whose budget has grown. So Ukrainian public media were the only media on the continent that actually had more money in 2024 than in 2023. And not being able to see the priorities in information space and combat the Russian disinformation with a pretty clever and sophisticated approach, which would include support to the public media, making sure that the private media don't go the partisan way like it happened in the United States or some other countries. making sure that the regulator is on top of things and making smart decisions. We usually see these things either not being paid, not paid enough attention, or in some cases neglected. When you compare Ukrainian public service broadcast and, for instance, Polish or Hungarian public service broadcast, then you actually have to ask yourself the question: who is a more Western player in this field? And Ukraine behaves in that sense much more efficiently. So the idea of Ukraine as a problem, I think, is outdated. The idea of Ukraine as a burden is outdated. I think Ukraine as a net contributor. I think Ukraine as a solution. And I think we don't have enough exchange. And I think we have the unmodernized, unmodified way of integrating Ukraine into the European affairs, which actually hurts both Ukraine and the European Union in general.
We see it in practical terms. We see, for example, with Ukrainian weapon producers who are seeking partners in Europe, for example, and they are facing kind of a very strange attitude, at least what I've heard from them, is that they are facing the attitude, okay, you kind of a raw material, okay, you provide us technologies, but we provide money, or we provide the possibility of scaling up, and therefore you're kind of a minor partner. And Ukrainian producers do not agree on that. And it's also the struggle for subjecthood or subjectivity. Maybe the last block of our conversation, let me ask you about NATO, because it's very important to understand what is happening in the global security. I have this impression, I want to share it with you, and I want to know your kind of a reaction on this. You are saying that basically European countries were perceiving security for granted, were taking it for granted, and this security was coming from the United States. And I agree with you that this idea that European Union is only the continent of peace basically hided the very history of the European integration, which did not start from the end of the Second World War. That started much earlier with an idea that republics need to defend themselves against the tyrannies and the empires. So now we have Trump, which is pushing European countries to increase their budgets. And this is very good. I think this is a positive thing for Europe that Trump is doing. Another probably positive thing is that it is pushing Europe to consolidate. We don't know whether this will be the case or not. But there are two dangers that I see. First, the conception of security in terms of money only. Because we see in this war that Russia is attacking Ukraine with a big number of cheap weapons. And a capacity to produce a lot of cheap weapons now is much more important today than the capacity to produce very little number of very expensive high-precision weapons. Now there is a concept among military technology people who are talking about affordable precision mass or something like that. So you need to have lots of precision, like drones, but in mass quantity. And I think this is something that European countries do not understand. And they still can be focused on the thing, okay, we will spend this number of money, we will produce, 10 tanks. While you need to spend this money to produce 10,000 drones, for example. Another problem that I see in Trump's discourse is that he's not saying that America or United States will leave NATO. But he increasingly talks about NATO as them. I don't know if you noticed them. Like he says, okay, America will produce weapons and NATO will buy it. But you are the NATO. And he's kind of meaning that NATO is actually European Union plus Canada and in the security thing. And that means, that brings me to the question, what will be the reaction of United States if, for example, Estonia or Latvia or Lithuania or Finland will be attacked? Will it not be reaction, okay, but this is NATO, and meaning that it's Europe's problem, or we will not react on this. And this leads me to the question about security guarantees. What we mean by security guarantees. Does the Ukraine's accession to NATO will become a security guarantees in a situation that we are not convinced that Article 5 will be applied when the eastern countries of the NATO will be attacked. What do you think?
Well, I think this is exactly the problem with NATO. It's the credibility problem. Article 5 works only if there's solid understanding that among the partners as well as adversaries that it will have consequences, that any attack will have consequences. But if you see that the partners will hesitate and some of them will have second thoughts and they will not be sure, well, then it's like the value of currency. You know, if the people don't trust the currency, it doesn't matter how healthy the other elements of the financial system are. You know, the currency just falls and in value, and that's exactly what happened with NATO. So the NATO promise is no longer carved in stone, and as a result, this is why the European Union has to actually get its act together, because with the kind of social transformation inside the United States, I don't think it's a matter of only Trump administration. We see that the Europeans will have to take care of their own security. So that means that the Europeans would have to come to realization that it's not going to end. This is not some kind of nightmare that we will wake up from. This is the beginning of a new period in history. It will likely protract into foreseeable future, and we have to learn the new rules of the game and act accordingly. And new rules of the game mean that if we do not act with understanding that the other side has to be sure that the Europeans are capable of raising the bar as high as is necessary, then the conflict will be escalating. If the Europeans are acting weak, they're actually inviting the escalation. They're inviting the greater Russian activity on its soil or in its information space. So being able to protect itself, which doesn't only mean to protect the sovereign states, but also meaning that the democratic system has to be protected, human rights have to be protected, the freedoms that societies enjoy have to be protected. And if these freedoms and democratic procedures are backed with significant military force, then the transactional cost for the aggressor becomes prohibitively high. And that's when the aggression does not happen. Well, in case of Ukraine, there's been a history of institutional weakness, both in Ukraine and outside of Ukraine, which actually invited Putin to grow the appetite for aggression. He annexed Crimea, and he didn't even get a slap on the wrist. Before that, he did the war with Georgia, and came out of that without any consequences. And before that, he was interfering in the political processes in the countries of the post-Soviet space, and no one even cared. So in that sense, I think the Europeans have to learn to protect themselves and be ready that they would have to protect themselves around the perimeter. This is exactly what Ukraine feels now that it should be ready to do, because we've already had the border closures with Poland, which is unthinkable from the Ukrainian perspective. This is something that will leave a bad scar in Ukrainian historical memory, because when the trucks with the dual-purpose drones are stuck in multi-dozen-kilometer lines on the border, and the drones do not come to the front line because someone decided to block the border, and the authorities are not acting adequately on the Polish side, or the grain is Ukrainian grain is spilled from the train cars. Then we have a situation in which we have to consider that the problems that we have with Russia in a violent way are mirrored with diplomatic problems that we have with Hungary, Slovakia, in some cases Poland, and God forbid if the elections would have gone the other way in Romania, Ukraine would be in a situation that potentially the entire western border of Ukraine would be cut off. And then the question is, if this is happening inside the EU, the question that we ask as Ukrainians, does the Lisbon Treaty stand? Does the Lisbon Treaty actually provide, fulfills its promise, provide its main idea? And should there be some kind of changes? Because otherwise, new unions will be formed. And we see this in form of deepened cooperation between Ukraine and Nordic Baltic countries. And in that sense, surprisingly, there's greater certainty about position of Iceland than position of Poland, which is paradoxical. But this is where we are, and I think if we don't want to see the fragmentation of the European security, and I think the transaction cost of creating new institutions will be tremendous. It's much cheaper to fix the existing institutions. Imagine now the cost of war for the European countries is already in trillions of euros. If someone would have told you 10 years ago or 15 years ago that the EU would have to spend $1 trillion for something that doesn't bring any tangible benefit, we would have a political outcry. There are other things that that money is needed for. That the Germans would have to amend the constitution because they would have to borrow more. This was something that was unthinkable, and now it's happening. And this is the price for being too slow and coming too late with too little. But the problem is that we're still not on track with the time. The events are still moving faster than the reaction for these events. So I anticipate that there will be even greater losses, even greater expenditures. We'll be eventually talking about much bigger money. We'll eventually be talking about way less comfortable conditions for the taxpayers, and the taxpayers will have to accept that either their conditions worsen or their children's condition worsen if this is done through the borrowing. But eventually, if we don't do it, it's going to be even more expensive. And the recovery will not be easy, because the recovery from the war will not only include rebuilding and cleaning up, etc. We have tremendous human losses. The demographic impact that the war has had on Ukrainian society, but not only on Ukrainian society. Look at young Poles have contributed to the price spikes on the realty market in Spain. This internal migration inside the European Union, which is related to security, is already felt. And if we understand what kind of other distortions may be happening because the threat is not being addressed properly, then we have to get ready to just open the wallets and pay more and more and more and more, all the way to the point of being insolvent.
This is very sobering, and I hope our listeners really will take their lessons from this conversation. Thank you, Yevhen Hlibovytskyi, for this talk.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
This was a podcast Explain Ukraine by UkraineWorld, an English language media outlet about Ukraine, run by Internews Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I am a Ukrainian philosopher, editor-in-chief of UkraineWorld, and president of PEN Ukraine. My guest today was Yevhen Hlibovytskyi, a prominent Ukrainian intellectual and director of the Frontier Institute. Let me remind you that you can support this podcast on Patreon. We rely on crowdfunding to keep our work going. You can also help fund our volunteer trips to frontline areas of Ukraine, where we support both civilians and soldiers. Donations are welcome via PayPal, and all relevant links are in the episode description. Thank you for listening. Stay with us and stand with Ukraine.